Hello, my name is Ben Charland. Welcome to What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. On July 22nd, a lone gunman opened fire on pedestrians and crowded restaurants on Danforth Avenue in the Greektown District of Toronto. He killed 2 and wounded 13 others before turning the gun on himself. Canadian media has been admirably restrained in the wake of this horrific act of violence, but the question remains, is this terrorism? Just a few days later, I went to Toronto and heard conversations about the shooting all over the city, on the subway, in cafes, on street corners, and in the comfort of people's homes. I visited an expert on terrorism, and you'll hear my interview with him in just a moment. But was this terrorism? Or was it a nut who just got his hands on a gun, or was it both? Fresh in Torontonians' minds is the attack a few months ago, on April 23rd, when a man used his van to target pedestrians in North Toronto. He killed 10 and wounded 16. Was that terrorism? If not, does the term senseless murder do the trick? Let's not forget also how much of a difference the names of the 2 perpetrators makes for our assumptions and descriptions of what happened. The van attacker in April did not have an Arabic name. The shooter from 2 weeks ago did. Maybe more than anyone, this matters for the cunning communicators of ISIS, which claimed responsibility only for the latter once they heard the name. But does it matter for our conversation? What's beneath the fear and the violence and the easy answers? What are the deeper forces at play? What on earth is going on? All right, Joseph McQuade is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Joseph, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. You deal a lot in your work with terrorism, especially terrorism in Southern Asia, but terrorism as a concept and as a phenomenon that has been around as an act has been around for a long time, but as a concept is actually relatively new. So I want to talk a lot with you about terrorism, especially in light of what happened recently here in Toronto, just in Greektown just a few days ago. But before we get there, as always, the first question on the show is, for you, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question, and it's something that I think a lot of people are asking. I think that people looking around at the world today are seeing a lot of things that are changing, new forms of media, old forms of politics that are kind of making a comeback. A lot of the kind of givens and norms that I think a lot of people through the 90s and even into the early 2000s really had kind of taken for granted as being a baseline,
right,
I think are beginning to disappear.
Right.
And so, after 9/11 and after the invasion of Iraq, there was a lot of talk about how kind of that kind of moment of American hegemony after the end of the Cold War was kind of challenged or was potentially over. But I think that what we're really seeing in more recent years is almost a more stark break even with the early 2000s,
right?
Particularly after the global financial crisis of 2008. I think that we're really just living in a changing world, and a lot of people are trying to understand all of the different kind of aspects of that change.
Why do you think that change is happening now, and why is it accelerating? Because I think one thing that is different about the change now than at any other previous time is the rate at which it's accelerating. Why do you think that is? I mean, you mentioned the global financial crisis, 9/11, the invasion of Iraq. These are pretty specific geopolitical and economic events. But what are the deeper forces at play that are causing this change that we're seeing right now, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the million-dollar question, right? And you could kind of bring in 100 academics and get 100 answers. I think that it's the kind of congruence of a number of different factors. I think one really important thing is the rise of social media and the rise of new media technologies. Right. This is something that can maybe be overstated sometimes, but I do think it really is integral to understanding a lot of the things that have happened. I mean, one common thread that unites a lot of the politicians around the world, regardless of their political orientation, is their strategic use of social media. And I mean, that's something that connects, Donald Trump to Justin Trudeau to Narendra Modi. All of these are figures who have really successfully built up kind of a campaign around their social media branding. I mean, the same was true of Barack Obama,
Sure.
right? And so people look at Donald Trump or kind of this, people look at this split between kind of the liberal politicians like Trudeau and Obama and the right-wing politicians like Trump or Modi, and view these as kind of two different strands of politics, and certainly in terms of what they represent.
Yeah.
That's absolutely true. They
Right.
stand for very different visions of how a society should be organized and how the kind of international order should function. But in terms of their ability to win over supporters and in terms of the tactics that they use to do that, I actually think there is a lot of common ground there, particularly in terms of the way that they use new forms of media.
Right.
And the same is true of, ISIS as well, and other kind of significant recent terrorist organizations.
Right.
And, obviously the goal isn't to say that, Obama and Trump and ISIS are in any way equivalent. They're all
Sure.
completely
Of
different,
course.
things. But at the same time, I do think that if we want to trace the origins of any of these different ideological movements, whether on the left, whether on the right, whether religious, whether secular, I do think that new forms of media technology do seem to be playing an increasing role.
Right. It's fascinating because you're talking a lot about new forms, say, of social media and new things that are happening. But in the very first thing you said there, that we're reverting to old forms of the way of doing things. So that is ironic, isn't it? That we seem to be going back to old forms, or what seem like old forms, and we also are seeing a rise of groups of people and ideologies that want it back to the way things were. Classic conservatism, to go back to the way things were, maybe in the halcyon days of the 1950s, or it depends on, I guess, your point of view, what you're looking at. But, what do you make of this distinction between, while we're seeing such new forms of technology, we seem to be reverting back to these old forms?
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing to remember there is that if we're talking about political movements from the 1920s or the 1930s, these are also movements that were capitalizing on new forms of media, right?
Right.
And so at this time, it was different, but it was, the advent of radio, or
Right.
the advent of being able to travel all around the country.
Yeah.
This was something that was relatively new in the 19th century. A politician couldn't, obviously trains existed, but there wasn't the same capacity to be able to just kind of, hop on a train and go all over the country, attending a rally in one city in the morning and then another one in the afternoon. And this, now they use airplanes to do it, and so they can cover more ground. But in the same way, you do have these new kind of transportation and information technologies, whether it's, the advent of the mass press or whether it's social media. I think that there is kind of something there as well.
It's one aspect of history that we often miss, I think, because it's so obvious, yet it's just, it isn't something that would come up in the history books. It's not identified with a year. And I'm talking about, of course, about mobility. In the 19th century, there was not just social mobility, but physical mobility. I could get on a train or on a boat, not only around the world, but in my own country. In the same day, I could travel as far as it would take someone weeks to travel.
And this completely transformed the way that people viewed their society. This is really how, at least according to many scholars, this is really how things like nationalism emerged, and a sense of belonging to a nation, because you could be exposed to other people from within your own country. It wasn't just about who lived in your village or who lived in your town anymore. You could, if you lived in London, you could get on a train and go to Liverpool. It wasn't common to do that for people, for kind of average working class people. But that ability was there, and certainly with the advent of kind of a mass press for the public, this is something that is totally intimately connected to the rise of terrorism, because terrorism, by definition, is seeking to invoke terror. And you can only invoke terror in people if they are aware of you. And so without a newspaper or in our case, a kind of 24-hour news cycle and social media, a terrorist attack is really just a murder, right? If there's no kind of immediate audience that sees it.
Right.
Whereas once that becomes amplified and makes the headlines, everybody becomes part of that, and everybody is watching that and views it as something that could happen to them, even though the odds of any individual person actually being killed in a terrorist attack in Canada or the US is so small. I mean, it's literally more likely to be killed by a falling television than killed by a terrorist if you live in Canada.
Right.
But, you know, we're not afraid of our televisions.
No. That's a fascinating insight, I think, because when I think of, say, the Middle Ages, and this might be a trite example, but if I were a king going into war, I would bring musicians and writers with me to talk about my heroic deeds on the battlefield. And my opponent would do the same, and the stories would be told, and the victor would probably get the chance to weave the final story. We now have musicians and scholars and writers and artists everywhere. And all of us have the technology, or most of us do anyways, on a phone that can fit in our pocket to record everything and tell that story in any situation. So therefore, if I want to make any kind of public act with myself as the villain or the hero for at least an audience on one part of the globe, I'm essentially guaranteed a story. I mean, there's some exceptions to this. For example, many cities' transportation systems, they don't talk about suicide. They don't talk about someone jumping in front of the train because they don't want to spread the word about this being a pretty good way to go, for example. That's a very small example. Most of the time, we are seeing stories being told without a filter. And in a democracy, we find that to be a good thing generally. But this seems to be the underside of this freedom of information and freedom of storytelling, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many people will use words like barbaric or medieval when they're describing the acts of terrorists. But the fact is, terrorism is very much the kind of flip side of the coin of modernity. It is something that only exists because of modern technologies, at least in the form that it exists. There were certainly kind of insurgent groups that fought asymmetrical wars, you know, as long as people have existed, and there's lots of examples of that through history. But in terms of this idea of terrorists as these people who can kind of you know, terrorize an entire nation or an entire globe through an act, this is something that really emerged in the 19th century with the advent of, you know, popular newspapers, because newspapers are primarily designed to sell, right? They're designed for consumption and for people to look at them.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly. Right. And so there is a bit of a symbiotic relationship that exists between the press and terrorists. Obviously, the press wouldn't like to see it that way.
Sure.
But in, you know, for the press, it makes for good headlines. And so, of course, they will always report it. But the thing is, for the terrorists, that makes for good publicity, and that can draw more people in. And that's something that ISIS has been, you know, really, I don't like to give them credit for anything, but they've been brilliant in terms of the way that they have manipulated that to their advantage. And I mean, I was reading just recently that I haven't seen this verified, so I'm certainly not kind of standing behind it as being a fact, but on social media, people were saying that ISIS had claimed credit for...
Yeah, that was out last night, I think.
For the Greektown attack. And I mean, at the same time, the police statement is still that they're actually not looking into any or not that they're not looking into, but that they have no reason to believe that there is a national security concern, that they are not at this time approaching this as an act of terrorism.
Yeah, and they've odd words from the from the public safety minister, Ralph Goodale, which is that there is no national security nexus.
Yeah.
I mean, I get what he's trying to say, but I'm not sure why they're using the word nexus. But maybe they're trying to sound like they're very, very much on top of things. But you're right that they've said that at the moment they see no national security nexus. But of course, and this is something I really want to talk about with you, ISIS is claiming responsibility because why wouldn't they? This is
exactly.
Once they probably found out the guy had an Arabic name. Might as well claim responsibility for it. Before we get there, I wanted to go back and talk about terrorism and the history of terrorism, because I do want to get to the Greektown shooting and I want to talk about ISIS. But I want to go back to an article that you wrote in the Conversation about a year ago after the attack in Manchester in the United Kingdom. And you talked about how we need to understand the history of terrorism in order to deal with it in the present. And one thing that you mentioned that I found fascinating was the rise of anarchism in Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. And that anarchists obviously believed that they needed to have very public acts of violence in order to achieve their ends. The assassination of McKinley, the U.S. president, I believe was by an anarchist or someone who was inspired by that. It was 1898, if I'm getting the year correct. And then, of course, that shaped a lot of, in the 1890s, it was a major feature of geopolitics, especially in Europe. But one thing that you brought up in your article was that anarchists believed in propaganda as deed. So that you could achieve your ends, propaganda, you could achieve your communication goals by having action, by taking action. That is something that's actually quite familiar to probably any listener. Don't talk, do, right? The classic adage, walk the talk, right? And it's a very dangerous idea because it can lead people to, making decisions that are quite harmful and violent. But to tie terrorism to the 19th century, I have two questions for you. Obviously, violent acts have been with humankind since the very beginning. Where does this idea of terrorism come from? And how do we define it? That's one of the trickiest parts of this very, very messy conversation about terrorism, because it's not just physically and politically messy, but it's also intellectually messy. How do we define terrorism and where does it come from?
Yeah, sure. So the two questions are definitely interconnected, but I'll start with the first. So the term terror goes back a long way. It's kind of the original etymology is from Latin. But in terms of using it to describe kind of political terror and then terrorism, that really comes about through the French Revolution with the period of the Terror, where essentially the revolutionaries establish a revolutionary government and, guillotine thousands of French aristocracy and, opponents. And here there's really, terror is being used as a tactic of rule. And I think the first reference that I know of for the actual term terrorism, I believe is 1798. And that is used to describe, this kind of political terror.
Right.
And so through the 19th century, the term terror is kind of often used in terms of state terror, and the term terrorism starts to be used as well. It primarily refers to the actions of states, though, through this time, and particularly it's used by a lot of English commentators to describe what they view as basically European despotic rulers. There's kind of, despite their own history of, imperialism, which is nothing if not despotic, around the world.
Right.
Within Britain itself, there is at this time an increasing sense of the importance of personal liberty, and there's kind of an expanding franchise. And so they're very concerned with European monarchies, which they view as being despotic. And so they often refer to kind of states of terror or state terror existing within those forms of government, in contrast to their own kind of more free society as they view it. But then there's also groups like the Fenians in Ireland and also in Canada, but of Irish descent, who, in response to the potato famine of the 1850s and in response to just kind of broader denial of rights as a result of there being a colony of Great Britain, start to resort to acts of violence like dynamiting trains and public places. And so the term terrorism kind of starts to be applied to them as well as non-state actors. And the other big example is in Russia, the people who are committing assassinations against the Russian Tsar. One Russian Tsar is actually assassinated in, I believe it's 1882. And so this group also comes to be referred to as the terrorists. But still, it is still often used in describing state terror, and I would say that that's still kind of the dominant usage. It's really in the 1920s and 1930s that I think you have a major shift. In 1937, there's an attempt by the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the UN, to pass a comprehensive international convention policing terrorism. And there they define terrorism solely as violence directed against a state.
Right.
And so, and I mean, it's not really a coincidence because, of course, it's states that are defining it. And so none of them want it to be something that is applicable to them as well.
Interesting that they defined it as the opposite of what it was before.
Yeah. Right? And this is reflecting kind of a broader trend throughout the interwar period where you have the rise of communism, you have the beginning of anti-colonial movements, and other groups that are kind of using insurgent tactics against states. And so and I mean, the League of Nations Convention isn't really what's usually thought about, but in terms of our kind of modern conception of terrorism through the prism of international law, it's actually very important. And a lot of the debates that they're having in 1937 are the same debates that we're having now in terms of, how do you define self-determination movements? How do you deal with the concept of state terror? Is there such thing as a legitimate use of force against a government if that government is not upholding certain duties or protecting certain rights?
Right. It sounds, I mean, it's fascinating because, I mean, to go back a few years to the 1890s again, when McKinley was assassinated in the United States, there seemed to be this international fear of terrorism that was going to upend, and maybe because it had anarchism behind it, that was going to upend the state, that was going to completely alter the capitalist paradigm that was becoming hegemonic in the Western world. And of course, just 3 decades before, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, and people didn't freak out in the same way. It was a major event in U.S. history, obviously, but people didn't think there's going to be a wave of assassinations and anti-state violence because there was no critical underpinning idea behind it, besides the Civil War, obviously. But in the 1890s and then ongoing in the First World War, there seemed to be this growing fear, especially amongst elites, that power was becoming too disseminated, and that those actors, such as we see today in the Middle East, I mean, it's really not that difficult to make a bomb, go onto a subway and blow it up, like happened in London. It's I mean, I don't mean to encourage people, obviously, but these aren't difficult things to achieve.
Well, and you don't even need to make a bomb. You can just get in a car or a van, right?
And that's right, precisely. And that's what I think made a lot of people afraid at the time, was that anybody can do this. And that's what we're fearful of now too, that technology and power and the ability to drive a vehicle, like you say, it's very easy. And the defenses we have are quite weak. Our defenses truly, maybe at the time were the same, are ideological and not just physical.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. I mean, these, the technology that has improved our lives in so many ways, at the same time has increased our capacity to kill by just, such a high order of magnitude. I mean, when you have, I don't want to get into kind of the whole Second Amendment debates, but there is, when you have an amendment that's written at a time when the only form of firearm is muskets, and you've now moved on to where you can have, semi-automatic weapons, there is just a big difference in terms of what you can do with one versus what you can do with the other. And so I think that our laws are often trying to kind of catch up to these things. And, the other thing is that one of the central functions of the state is to have a monopoly on violence, right? That's part of what the goal of the state is, to regulate violence and kind of be the sole arbiter of violence, really. And so if someone murders someone, then that person, because before you had, before we had such centralized kind of bureaucratic states, it was much more, if someone killed someone, then someone from that family would kill someone from that person's family. That was very common in medieval Europe. It was much more of a kind of almost vigilante justice model, but it was actually a model of justice that was kind of recognized across the board in terms of how justice...
And condoned by the state.
Yeah, because the state didn't have the capacity to be able to actually regulate, these huge swaths of territory. The French monarchy in the Middle Ages really controlled kind of the area around Paris, and then had kind of nominal control through their different... fiefdoms and stuff of other parts. But there wasn't this kind of state capacity, whereas now we have states that are supposed to have control really over everything that happens within their territory. And so when you have violence that's totally either against the state or totally outside the control of the state, that's very unsettling to people. And it's particularly unsettling to states because it really comes across as kind of a failure of the state to protect its citizens. Even though, in some ways, it may just not be realistic to think that, especially when we're talking about these things where someone takes a hatchet or a car and they're kind of a lone actor, in fairness, how is the state supposed to preempt that? I mean...
But there is a growing expectation that it should.
Yeah.
I think that obviously 300 years ago, we would have found that ridiculous. You should have your own gun to defend yourself when someone comes on your property. But there is a growing understanding of the state, and there are many people who believe that this is the whole problem, that the state has become too large, and it's time for people to reclaim a sort of self-reliance. But if you live in a city like Toronto, I mean, it's absurd to think that everybody should be carrying a gun around. I mean, I can't. I would love to hear someone argue with me on that, and I'd love to have them on the show, but I cannot understand how that would make anybody's life better. But in the United States, for example, there's the growth of the stand your ground laws, right? I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but essentially the idea is that if someone is being violent towards you or even threatening violence, it's not incumbent upon you to run away. If you pull out your gun and shoot that person, you are within the law because you stood your ground. Of course, any reasonable person would say if someone's being a loser and trying to go after you with a gun or a knife or whatever, your first thing to do is to get away. If you can't get away, then stand your ground. But they're saying stand your ground first. And it's a distortion or maybe just a different perspective of the monopoly of violence that the state has exerted or tried to exert for a long time. But I want to get to the other question, which is, how do we define terrorism? Can you give a definition for what terrorism is that we can operate with in this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll give kind of my definition of it. I mean, there is no kind of commonly accepted definition, and any definition is problematic in some ways. I think that the simplest way of understanding terrorism for me is that terrorism is really, if we think about kind of person or persons A, person or persons B, and person or persons C, what makes terrorism distinct is that it's violence committed by person or persons A against B, where the goal is influencing C. And so if you have a murder, it's person A killing person B, and the goal of that act is to kill person B.
Right.
Terrorism, to me, is when the goal of killing person B is not... Killing person B is almost a secondary goal. The goal is actually influencing or terrorizing or, causing some sort of change in person C.
Right.
And person C can be a person. It can be a, minority community. It can be a government. It can be a public. But really, I think that's what sets it apart. And to me, that is kind of the most nonpartisan definition,
Okay.
because then, and the problem is terrorism is such a morally laden term
Yeah.
that it becomes very, saying that one group of people are terrorists or are not terrorists becomes a huge kind of political
Right.
mudslinging
And this is
match.
where it gets so messy.
Yeah.
It seems to me that when a significant act of mass violence occurs, school shootings in the United States, for example, the attack just a few days ago in Greektown here in Toronto. Here's another example: is the shooter in Las Vegas. I guess that was a year or just over a year ago, where he went into a hotel room and took his rifle or rifles, had been stashing weapons in there for days, and just picked off people at a country music festival and killed over 50.
Yeah.
I think it was 58 or 59 people who died in this Las Vegas attack. And people at the time wondered, well, is this terrorism? And of course, it was an important question, because here was a white male engaging in a clearly terrorizing act, because the purpose of what he was doing was not just to murder people, but to create mayhem and chaos. There was a person C in that equation: the people who were watching, the people who were at the music festival but weren't hit, for example. But obviously, I don't know what his motives are. I don't think that's been discussed by the FBI. I mean, I'm sure it's been discussed, but I mean, we don't know what the motive of that attack was. But knowing what we do know, is that terrorism, or does terrorism require an ideological ingredient in order to make it so?
Yeah, so most definitions, most kind of commonly accepted legal definitions, require an ideological, political, or religious motivation. I think the problem is that when we get into asking, is one thing an act of terror or not, and I don't mean you doing this,
No.
I just mean in general, this is often what happened. And I mean, this has been happening with the Greektown thing, right? Everyone's trying to determine, was it terrorism, was it not terrorism?
Right.
And to me, it's kind of a funny thing to be asking, because to me, I think that if our goal is kind of minimizing harm and addressing acts of mass violence, then we should really be looking at all acts of mass violence within kind of the same analytical category, whether the term we want to use for that is terrorism or not. Because the fact is, the actual profiles of the people who commit these kinds of acts are often quite similar. Typically and not in the way that, many people think. Many people think, if there's a mass killing, they immediately jump to assuming that it's a Muslim.
Right.
And that's just not accurate. I mean, from 2000 to 2016, according to FBI crime statistics, which is not kind of, a left-wing source, attacks by white supremacists outnumber attacks by jihadists within the United States by a ratio of about 2 to 1.
Wow.
So they unequivocally said in I think it was a 2016 or 2017 report, that the number one threat of domestic terrorism was white supremacists. That's the FBI saying that, with number two being Islamic extremism.
Right.
But that's obviously very different from what people's common perception is. But at the same time, so if you take out the kind of looking at these actors in terms of their particular ideological motivations, and instead look at kind of mass killers within kind of across the spectrum,
Right.
you do find that there's a lot of commonalities. They're typically a male in his 20s, usually, or at least often, with some sort of history of either domestic abuse, in terms of him being the abuser,
Sure.
or of a kind of untreated or insufficiently treated mental illness. And just a side note there, that it's very important that we not, take that as an opportunity to stigmatize people with mental
Sure.
illness, because
Yeah.
it's still, obviously, people with mental illness are more likely to be victims than perpetrators.
Right.
But at the same time, there's those, and then there's also kind of, that he has access to some sort of weaponry that he's able to use
Right.
to do this. And with the advent of these kind of vehicular killings, that category has kind of been expanded a lot, because, people can use their car to do it. At the same time, though, having access to a firearm just across the board increases the number of casualties. I mean, that's
Right.
just kind of a fact.
Yeah, there are. Sorry to interrupt, but when you talk about access to a weapon, that is so important. And a lot of people who study suicide have. I mean, that's an obvious thing. If you have access to a means for suicide that is easy for you to use, then you're more likely, if you're already having suicidal thoughts, you're more likely to go through with the act. And there was an interesting study done in Israel. I'm not sure when this was, but they had suicide rates rising in the military. People who were in the Israeli Defense Forces started to take their own lives in greater and greater numbers. And they tried to tackle this problem from multiple fronts. Obviously, why are they doing this? Where are these ideas coming from? Are they dissatisfied in some deep way being here in the military? And they also tackled the availability of firearms. And the one thing that they were able to accomplish and then demonstrate as proof in this study was they had the soldiers lock up their weapons at night and when they weren't using them in training or in operations. And suicide rates dropped. And they were able to isolate that as a significant cause for the drop of suicide rates. And I think you could apply the same lens to terrorism and the availability of means of violence and mass terror. It's not a cause of terror,
No.
but if we can reduce that, then we are going a little bit of the ways to solving the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't prevent attacks from happening, as we've seen. People will use a hatchet or a kitchen knife or a car, but it reduces their capacity to cause casualties.
Right.
And that's just a fact.
Right, and if my only available weapon is a knife, I might think twice before going through with something, right? But this is very difficult because what are we going to do? I mean, make it that much harder to rent a car or to buy a car and to get a driver's license? I mean, this becomes a difficult conversation when terrorism spreads into the realms of normality, really.
Well, and I think that it's also, I think the important thing is devoting more resources and energy towards understanding why people are committing these acts and moving outside of this kind of more simplistic version of just basically, policing Muslims and looking for extreme, because again, I mean, Islamic extremism is a problem, and ISIS has, issued this call around the world, which many people have taken up. But at the same time, what's interesting about ISIS recruitment versus Al-Qaeda's recruitment is that Al-Qaeda tends to pull in people on the basis of particular issues and then looks to radicalize them once they've drawn them in. So they'll bring someone in based on, Bosnia, or based on Chechnya, or based on...
Or American troops in Saudi Arabia, which was the classic one in the 90s. Yeah.
Exactly. And so they'll use one of these issues. They've even more recently turned towards using kind of climate change as well. And so they look to pull people in with those kinds of single issues. And then once they've pulled them in, they radicalize them.
Right.
So that they're more willing to carry out acts of violence. With ISIS, their recruits tend to be, it tends to kind of go the other way around, where it's actually people who are more ready to commit acts of violence from the beginning, and then they kind of pull them in through this ideology. And so there is just kind of a difference there, and there's a lot of differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS in terms of their organizational structure, but I think that in terms of why we see so many more ISIS lone wolf attacks and why they've been so much more able to do that, essentially what they do is, and again, we've seen that with them, allegedly taking credit for the Greektown attack, they are really just looking to kind of stamp their brand on any kind of violent act around the world that doesn't have a clear other motivation. And by doing that, it enhances the perception of the risk that they pose to people in the West. People in the West have always been disproportionately afraid of ISIS. People, Yazidis and people living in Iraq and Syria absolutely have had, extremely strong reason to be afraid of ISIS. It was a terrifying organization and had a lot of, local regional power. But it never had that much capacity to actually reach outside, other than through these kind of isolated incidents, which are obviously very serious and need to be dealt with.
Yeah.
But in many of these cases, it's people who do not have a direct kind of material link to ISIS. It's people who are
Right.
kind of inspired by the ideology and then kind of put that stamp on their act of violence as a way of legitimizing it.
Yeah, I'm quite struck by what you're saying here, and I think that if you were to say fast forward by 500 years and take a vision of what's going on, what on earth is going on here, from us in the future or an alien civilization taking a look, what would they see and what would they say is going on? And I think they would maybe see what you're saying, which is that there's a rise in people, often males in their 20s, who may come from a dysfunctional family or have some kind of abuse in their past or seem to lack direction. And there are multiple causes for this. Automation, for example, is a cause in the Western world of, there's just not really much in the future for me. I don't know what I'm going to do for a living if robots are going to do my jobs and the government is just going to keep me on welfare. And of course, in the Middle East, you have a problem that's been there for decades, which is huge unemployment numbers amongst young people. So there's nothing to do. And so when I'm going online or I'm just talking to my buddy and he's telling me, or I see in a video on YouTube about taking control through violence and terrorism, giving meaning to your life. It sounds like the ISIS model as opposed to the Al-Qaeda model. It sounds like I'm looking for something and I've found it. And it gives me meaning, it gives me purpose, and I can make headlines and I can be somebody, because all the other available opportunities that may have been available to, say, my parents or my grandparents' generations are dissipating before my very eyes. And I think that this alien civilization would see very clearly that this isn't that ideas are important, but it's not just the ideas. That the forces at play are the situation that a 24-year-old kid living in Cairo and another 24-year-old kid living in, or a 31-year-old kid living in Toronto, take measures in their own hands like this, and it's almost corrupted by the idea after the fact as opposed to before. And I think that what you're saying is really quite incisive for understanding what's happening with this. Do you think that, what do we do about that? I mean, we're talking about huge issues at play. I mean, automation is an issue that is, that's a whole other episode, really. But what do we do? I mean, how do we tackle this problem?
Yeah, the problem is we really, our society is very much built on kind of false premises these days, because people look to the 1950s and the post-war as kind of the model of how the kind of stages of life should go. You go to school, you probably go to college now, you get a job, you're married, you buy a house, all of this kind of stuff that happened in the kind of boomer generation. The thing is, the boomer generation is a historical anomaly. It's really stands alone in history in a lot of ways, and for a lot of reasons, but particularly because of how profound an impact the Second World War had on the reorganization of society and on, the creation of all of these manufacturing jobs. And in terms of these manufacturing jobs too, that also is part of a bigger story with the industrialization of the West as a result of the capital that it had from its colonial empires. But so really looking in kind of zooming out for a second and looking at the big picture, these kinds of manufacturing jobs that we're talking about bringing back have primarily existed within Asia historically. Typically, China and India have been kind of the economic centers of the world that have produced, the silk and the spices and the textiles and the commodities that have been sought after. There's a reason that Europe went and colonized Asia and not the other way around. And it's not that Europe was superior, it's that Europe wanted what Asia had. Asia had no reason to go and colonize Europe because economically it wasn't a particularly prosperous region until really kind of, the last 500 years, and I would say even really the last 200 to 300
Right.
years.
Right.
And so, but through industrialization, we've now created all of these good jobs within Europe and within America, and the expectation is that these jobs will stay. But they're now shifting back primarily
Right.
to Asia, where you have massive economic growth. And so people don't know what to make of this, because the expectation is that they would be able to have the jobs that their parents had, and those jobs are just moving back to where historically they have typically been.
Right.
And so you have a lot of people who have been left behind by that. And so, I mean, that is a big issue, and it means that there's a lot of people who, end up looking for easy answers to their problems, and those answers can be supplied by any kind of ideology,
Right.
really, So, I mean, that's one element of it, and I think it's a significant element of it. I think that we really need to redefine how we think about terrorism, potentially think about how useful terrorism is as a term, given how kind of morally laden it is. But if we do want to keep using it, we need to make it a more precise term that can apply across the board and not just be kind of ideologically driven to refer to some acts of mass violence
Right.
and not others. Because what we have is this conflation of terrorism with Islam that means that people view the solution to terrorism as being, increasing policing or bombing of Muslim communities. And I mean, this just doesn't work.
Right.
One thing that I just kind of thought of recently that's really just bizarre to think about, children born while Iraq was being invaded in 2003 are 15 years old now. So when we're talking about young people, from 15 to 25, they've grown up in a war zone. And so, these kinds of military solutions, there is a place for them, certainly in terms of dealing with ISIS. No one is saying that, they should have just been allowed free reign. It's very good that their capacity has been degraded and that they've been driven out of, Raqqa and their other strongholds. But at the same time, we can't think that the solution to this is always, more bombing. Just recently, the U.S. government was kind of floating the threat of regime change in Iran. And I mean, that would just be a terrible idea. Iran right now, there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of human rights issues.
Right.
The system of government is certainly far from perfect, but there are democratic elements to it at the same
Right.
time. Rouhani is, again, not saying that I'm, his fan, but he is a relative moderate.
Right.
The last time there was regime change in Iran was 1953, when the prime minister was overthrown. There was then 20 years of rule by the Shah, which resulted in an extreme government taking over in 1979. So these kind of military solutions within the Middle East are just, I mean, for one thing, as we talked about, this kind of jihadist terrorism is only one side of a multifaceted issue in terms of mass violence. There are so many other things like white supremacy that need to be taken, at least equally seriously.
Right.
But even in looking at jihadist terrorism, these kind of military solutions, if we're not careful in how they're applied, will often just end up creating,
Sure.
worse opponents
Yeah.
to fight.
Right, and I mean, it's as if we're trying to play whack-a-mole
Yeah.
with this emerging idea of terrorism or emergent idea of terrorism. And if we try to pinhole it as being one kind of thing, then it's just probably going to rear its head somewhere else, because the fundamental problems are deeper than that. I mean, we can talk about how the current threat to the liberal democratic order in the Western world is quite possibly, quite simply, because of a lack of economic growth, stability, and prosperity since, say, 1973. So you had that incredible post-war golden era between 45 and 73. And then since 73, it's been in fits and starts, but we still believe that things are going to keep getting better. And technology is making us believe that convincingly, because every day there's a new gadget that I can get, and it feels like the world is moving forward, even though wages might be declining, unemployment might be rising. And even though in the United States you have record low unemployment numbers, a lot of that is because people aren't declaring themselves even part of the workforce anymore. And so there are systemic problems at play that are linked with what we're talking about with terrorism. And I'm skeptic. Here's my devil's advocate, because I'm not really, playing devil's advocate almost to myself, because I do buy the fact that terrorism is concomitant to all that we've talked about. And if we looked at it at a grand scale, it's a lot about people who are lost, looking for a reason to have meaning, and they can pick Islamic terrorism as much as they can pick white supremacy, for example. But I do believe that ideas can be dangerous, and ideas have incredible potent power. Looking at the 19th century back again, and the rise of anarchism in the 1890s. I mean, sure, there were deeper forces at play with the rise of mass media and the feeling that person A can attack person B in order to affect person C, which was your definition from earlier. But that idea still has an incredibly potent power. And I think that we still, and let me know what you think about this, that we still need to counter dangerous and insidious ideas themselves. And perhaps have that conversation had, so that if I'm a lost soul, a lost 31-year-old soul about to go to Greektown, maybe I can see the other side of the story. Maybe I can see something else that gives me meaning. That's extremely simplistic, I know. But to what extent do we need to counter the dangerous ideas themselves as part of this?
Yeah, no, I mean, and so just also just responding to an earlier part of that, when you were talking about kind of this period 1945 to 1970 as this kind of golden age of opportunity, I think it's also important for our conversation to recognize who was that an opportunity, who was that a golden age for?
Absolutely.
Because of course it's really only, I mean, they're ongoing, but the civil rights movement, LGBT rights, women's rights, those are things that really were kind of percolating and really emerging in this time as these mass movements. And a lot of, if we're talking about the white supremacy side of the coin, a lot of that is not just about the kind of economic insecurity that is happening because of these larger forces, but it's also about where the blame for that economic insecurity is being gone. And this sense that it's not just that, why can't I have the job that my dad had? It's why do these people get to have a job now when I don't? And so there is that kind of identity dimension to it that I think ties into what you're saying about ideology. There's where people, place the blame for this. When in looking at the presidential primaries, the two candidates who in some ways stood poles apart but were really speaking to the same audience were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders was speaking to all of these issues of economic insecurity, but he wasn't, speaking about them through the lens of identity politics. He was speaking about them more through the lens of kind of the accumulation of capital among, a 1% or a tenth of 1% of the population at the expense of everyone else.
And the accelerating inequality.
Yeah, exactly. And so that if we're talking about kind of the role of ideology and alternate visions, that is kind of an alternate vision for that economic inequality that isn't saying that, the jobs don't exist because they're being taken by immigrants. It's saying the jobs don't exist for all of these other reasons, because for businesses it's more profitable to automate or to outsource than it is for them to actually hire workers within their own country, or just hire workers at a fair wage in general, or just to kind of redistribute profits or redistribute the wage structure in a way that is kind of more equitable across the board. So that's kind of on the white supremacy side of the board. And I mean, I also, just as kind of a caveat, I also don't want to be implying that kind of white supremacy and jihadism are the only two forms of terrorism. There are lots of others, but I just wanted to kind of,
Absolutely,
make a point of saying that. But at the same time, it is a limited conversation, and I think they are kind of two useful things to talk about.
Yeah.
But so, then on the flip side of it, in terms of addressing jihadism, part of this is recognizing that there are a lot of, actually the majority of Muslim voices are not extremists, and, that they may be pushing a version of society or a version of democracy that is different than, it may not be as secular sometimes as what we view as kind of what a democracy should be. These communities tend to be more religious than communities in Europe, for example. But that doesn't mean that they're extremists, and that, we need to work with just, across the board Muslim communities that are really at the front line of the fight against jihadism and are typically the first victims of it. I mean, there's often, when an attack comes and the perpetrator is Muslim, there's always this call for the Muslim community to condemn the attack. And the fact is they repeatedly do. There are, mass marches by moderate Muslims all the time that don't get a lot of press coverage. They're constantly denouncing these things within these communities, and often recruits to ISIS, many of them are actually recent converts to Islam as well. I mean, there was kind of the famous example where there was one of the kind of foreign fighters that was flying over to Syria had a copy of Islam for Dummies that he was reading on the plane.
Right.
But that is actually, in some ways, representative. Not always, but a lot of the recruits for ISIS, or the people who become kind of indoctrinated, are not they're not really pulling, for the most part, in Western societies from devout Muslims. They're typically pulling, again, from people who are,
right,
in other ways having issues, whether it be, actual issues of psychosis, or whether the person is kind of a violent individual to begin with. Many of them have criminal records. But again, it's not, we need to challenge, I think, the idea that extremism is something that is coming out of Muslim communities. There is kind of an Islamic ideological orientation to groups like ISIS, obviously. But we need to differentiate that from kind of the average Muslim communities, which, I mean, just recently, a year or two ago, I think 6 Muslims were killed and 8 were injured in Quebec City when in that mosque shooting. So again, I mean, and that is just in terms of kind of the more well-known one, but there's lots of incidents where mosques are set on fire, where Muslim women actually are targeted more than Muslim men because the hijab makes them identifiable. And so people who claim that their opposition to Islam is their commitment to women's rights are going out there and, beating pregnant Muslim women.
Right.
So we need to really rethink how we approach, both of these ideologies and other ideologies, and think about what makes them seductive to people, and not just, fall for these much easier or simpler ideas that, certain communities are kind of inherently more violent or inherently more predisposed towards these acts of violence. Because, I mean, the facts don't bear that out. It's much more complex than that.
And not just communities, but communities of ideas. So Islam being a community of idea. I mean, obviously Muslims are hundreds of millions of people on this planet, most of whom don't know one another, but they share a common set of beliefs and rituals and so forth. And that community of ideals and ideas is not more or less susceptible than others. There are other forces at play. Joseph, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. I wish we could go further, but thanks again.
Great. Thanks very much for having me.
That's the show. Your quote of the week is from a novel back in 2016 by Pawan Mishra called Coin Man, An Untold Conspiracy. Here goes. It was much easier to explain the veil than to answer questions about the wounds. Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.